Bradley Nowell. He created the sound that defined Southern California, but the demons that fueled his music ultimately silenced his voice forever. San Francisco, May 25, 1996. Bradley Nowell is gone, needle on the nightstand, Lou Dog at his feet. 1 week before Sublime would conquer the world, their voice fell silent. At 28 years old, Bradley Nowell was dead from a heroin overdose just 7 days before Sublime's self-titled album would be released and change rock history. The music that would make him a legend was already recorded. The tour that would have made him a household name was already booked. But the man who created it all would never see his dreams realized. "I was always searching for a sound that was ours, not anyone else's," he had told a reporter just months before his death, his eyes carrying the weight of someone fighting battles that few could see. "Music was my escape, but it also became my prison." The irony was cruel and complete. The songs that spoke of love, life, and liberation were created by someone trapped in the darkest corners of addiction. The voice that sang "What I Got" with such joy and gratitude belonged to a man who couldn't hold on to anything. Not his health, not his relationships, not his life. But how does someone who created such beautiful music about connection and community die alone in a motel room? The answer lies in the collision between artistic genius and personal demons, between the Southern California dream and the nightmare of addiction, between a sound that could unite thousands and a silence that would haunt them forever. This is the story of Bradley Nowell, not just another rock tragedy, but a cautionary tale about how the very sensitivity that creates great art can also destroy the artist who channels it. Born Bradley James Nowell on February 22, 1968 in Long Beach, California, he entered a world that was being reshaped by musical revolution and cultural collision. Long Beach in the late 1960s was a melting pot of sounds and stories. Punk rock emerging from LA's underground, reggae flowing north from Jamaica through immigrant communities, ska revival brewing in warehouse venues, and hip-hop beginning to find its voice in urban neighborhoods. His father, Jim Nowell, was a construction foreman who understood the value of hard work and practical skills. His mother, Nancy, worked as a flutist and music teacher, bringing melody and harmony into their middle-class home. The combination would prove prophetic. Bradley inherited his father's stubborn determination and his mother's musical sensitivity, a blend that would both create his unique artistic vision and fuel his self-destructive tendencies. The household was loving but complex. Jim wanted his son to appreciate the dignity of physical labor and practical achievement, while Nancy encouraged his musical exploration and creative expression. Bradley learned to navigate between these expectations, developing the ability to charm both worlds while fully belonging to neither. His childhood in Long Beach exposed him to the cultural diversity that would later define Sublime's sound. The neighborhood kids came from Mexican-American families who brought conjunto and mariachi traditions, Black families who introduced him to funk and hip-hop, and white punk rockers who taught him about rebellion and raw energy. Most importantly, there were the Jamaican immigrants who carried reggae and ska in their hearts, sharing Bob Marley and Jimmy Cliff with anyone willing to listen. But even as a child, Bradley showed signs of the restless energy and need for stimulation that would later manifest as addiction. He was bright but couldn't sit still in school, charming but sometimes destructive, creative but often unable to channel his energy constructively. Teachers described him as someone with enormous potential who seemed determined to sabotage his own success. The discovery of music provided focus for his scattered energies. His mother's piano lessons gave him basic musical literacy, but it was the guitar that became his true voice. At 12, he received his first acoustic guitar and immediately began teaching himself songs by ear. displaying the kind of intuitive musical understanding that can't be taught. But Bradley wasn't content with playing other people's songs exactly as written. Even as a teenager, he was experimenting with different styles, combining punk aggression with reggae rhythms, adding ska upstrokes to hip-hop beats, creating hybrid sounds that shouldn't have worked but somehow did. The cultural landscape of 1980s Long Beach provided perfect conditions for musical experimentation. The punk scene was still raw and accessible, with local venues like the Foothill and Fender's Ballroom hosting shows by unknown bands who might become legends. The Mexican-American community maintained strong musical traditions while embracing new sounds from both sides of the border. And the beach culture encouraged the kind of laid-back creativity that could blend seemingly incompatible genres into something entirely new. But Long Beach was also a place where economic tensions and cultural conflicts created the kind of authenticity that couldn't be manufactured. The city's working-class foundation meant that pretension was quickly exposed and discarded. Musicians had to prove themselves through substance rather than style, through connection with real experiences rather than manufactured personas. The reggae influence that would become central to Sublime's sound came through the Jamaican community that had established itself in Long Beach during the 1970s and early 1980s. These families brought not just Bob Marley's recordings, but deeper knowledge of ska, rocksteady, and roots reggae traditions that mainstream American audiences had never experienced. Bradley's introduction to this music came through friendships rather than formal education. He would spend afternoons at friends' houses where older siblings played Dennis Brown and Gregory Isaacs, where conversations included Jamaican patois, where the spiritual and political dimensions of reggae were understood as naturally as its rhythmic innovations. But Bradley's approach to reggae was never imitative. He understood instinctively that authenticity came from bringing your own experience to the music rather than trying to replicate someone else's cultural context. His reggae-influenced songs would deal with Southern California experiences, beach parties, police harassment, suburban alienation, rather than Jamaican themes that he hadn't lived. The ska revival happening simultaneously in Long Beach provided another crucial element for Sublime's developing sound. Bands like the Untouchables and Fishbone were proving that horn sections could coexist with punk aggression, that danceable rhythms could carry serious social commentary, that musical joy and political awareness could reinforce rather than contradict each other. Bradley absorbed these lessons while developing his own approach to genre fusion. Where other bands might alternate between different styles within a single song, Bradley learned to layer them simultaneously. Punk guitars over reggae bass lines, ska rhythms under hip-hop vocals, creating dense musical textures that required multiple listens to fully appreciate. High school brought both musical development and the first serious experiments with drugs and alcohol. Bradley discovered that substances could temporarily quiet the anxiety and restless energy that had plagued him since childhood, while also seeming to enhance his musical creativity and social confidence. What began as typical teenage experimentation quickly became something more systematic and problematic. Bradley's personality was naturally addictive. When he found something that provided relief or pleasure, he wanted more of it immediately and completely. This trait would later serve his musical obsessions, but also fuel his struggles with substance dependency. His academic performance suffered as his focus shifted increasingly toward music and partying. Teachers who had recognized his intelligence and potential found themselves dealing with a student who was physically present, but emotionally and intellectually elsewhere. His grades reflected someone whose priorities had shifted completely away from conventional measures of success. But the adults in his life struggled to understand whether his behavior represented typical teenage rebellion or something more concerning. The line between normal experimentation and problematic patterns wasn't clearly defined in the late 1980s. particularly in environments where substance use was relatively common and accepted. His parents, Jim and Nancy, found themselves caught between wanting to support their son's musical interests and growing concern about his lifestyle choices. They could see his talent and passion for music, but they also observed behavior patterns that suggested potential problems ahead. The formation of Sublime in 1988 with bassist Eric Wilson and drummer Bud Gaw represented both culmination and beginning. Wilson and Gaw were fellow Long Beach natives who shared Bradley's musical tastes and his disregard for conventional genre boundaries. But they also brought their own personalities and musical influences to the collaboration. Eric Wilson's bass playing provided the foundation that allowed Bradley's experiments to work. His understanding of reggae rhythms was deep enough to provide authenticity, while his punk rock sensibility kept the music energetic and accessible. Most importantly, he possessed the kind of steady personality that could anchor a band led by someone as unpredictable as Bradley. Bud Gaw's drumming was similarly crucial to Sublime's sound. He could shift between punk's driving beats and reggae's laid-back grooves within the same song, providing rhythmic continuity that made Bradley's genre-hopping experiments feel natural rather than jarring. His background in metal and hardcore also brought technical precision that elevated their sound above typical garage band amateurism. But perhaps most importantly, Wilson and Gaw were genuinely fond of Bradley as a person, not just as a creative partner. Their friendship provided emotional support during his struggles while also creating the kind of musical chemistry that couldn't be manufactured or faked. The early days of Sublime were characterized by pure enthusiasm and complete lack of commercial calculation. They played anywhere that would have them, house parties in suburban neighborhoods, all ages shows at community centers, opening slots at punk venues where audiences initially had no idea what to make of their reggae-influenced sound. These performances were rough around the edges but undeniably powerful. Bradley's stage presence was magnetic from the beginning. He possessed the kind of natural charisma that could win over skeptical audiences through sheer force of personality and genuine love for the music he was creating. The band's early songs dealt with experiences that their audiences immediately recognized: drinking beer at the beach, conflicts with police, romantic relationships complicated by immaturity and substance use. The honesty in Bradley's lyrics created immediate connections with listeners who felt that mainstream rock music had lost touch with their actual lives. But even during these early performances, Bradley's relationship with substances was beginning to create problems for the band. He might deliver a brilliant performance one night and be completely incapacitated the next, creating uncertainty that made it difficult to build consistent momentum with venues and fans. His bandmates learned to work around his unpredictability, but the pattern was concerning. They could see how substances affected his reliability and judgment, but they also recognized that his creativity and stage presence were irreplaceable elements of their sound. The underground success of their early recordings demonstrated both the power of their musical vision and the growing challenges posed by Bradley's personal struggles. Their 1992 debut album 40 Ounces to Freedom was recorded for less than $1,000 in a makeshift studio. But it captured something vital that major label productions often missed. The album's title track became an anthem for their growing fan base, but it also revealed Bradley's complex relationship with substances. The song celebrated drinking and partying while also acknowledging their potential consequences, creating the kind of nuanced perspective that separated Sublime from bands that simply glamorized excess. Songs like Date Rape tackled serious social issues with humor and moral clarity that belied their DIY production values. Bradley could address sexual assault and violence while maintaining the musical energy and accessibility that kept audiences engaged rather than preached to. But the album also included tracks like Pool Shark that dealt more directly with addiction and its consequences. These songs provided glimpses into Bradley's personal struggles that many fans initially missed, but that would become more obviously autobiographical as his problems intensified. The success of 40 Ounces to Freedom in Southern California created opportunities for broader exposure, but it also increased the pressures and temptations that Bradley was already struggling to manage. More shows meant more money, which meant greater access to drugs. Bigger audiences provided validation, but also anxiety about maintaining authenticity while achieving commercial success. The early 1990s alternative rock explosion created possibilities for bands like Sublime to reach national audiences, but it also created pressure to conform to industry expectations about image and sound. Bradley was naturally resistant to any attempt to change Sublime's music for commercial reasons, but he also understood that success could provide the financial security that would allow them to continue making music on their own terms. By the early 1990s, Bradley's heroin use had progressed from occasional experimentation to regular dependency that began to affect every aspect of his life and relationships. The drug initially seemed to enhance his creativity while providing relief from anxiety and depression. But tolerance and physical dependence quickly created new problems that were more serious than the ones heroin was supposed to solve. The progression from recreational use to addiction followed patterns that Bradley didn't recognize until they were already entrenched. What seemed like a solution to immediate problems became the source of much larger difficulties that affected not just his health but his relationships, his musical productivity, and his ability to function as a reliable band member. His attempts to hide his growing dependency created additional stress and dishonesty in his relationships with bandmates, family, and romantic partners. The energy required to maintain his habit while concealing its extent left him exhausted and emotionally unavailable to the people who cared most about him. "Heroin is a demon," he wrote in his journal during one of his many attempts at sobriety. "I thought I could ride it, but it's been riding me." The admission revealed his awareness of the problem, but awareness alone was insufficient to overcome the physiological and psychological grip of addiction. Friends and family members found themselves walking on eggshells, never knowing which version of Bradley they would encounter. The charming, creative person they loved, or the unreliable, manipulative person that addiction had created. The unpredictability placed enormous strain on relationships that had once been sources of support and joy. His relationship with Troy Dendecker was particularly complicated by his drug use. Troy loved the person Bradley could be when he was clean and healthy, funny, affectionate, creative, genuinely caring about her well-being and their future together. But she also became the target of his worst behavior when addiction took control of his priorities and judgment. Their relationship became a cycle of hope and disappointment, commitment and betrayal that neither of them fully understood how to break. Troy would support Bradley's attempts at sobriety while also protecting herself from the emotional damage caused by his relapses. The birth of their son Jacob in 1995 provided Bradley with powerful motivation to address his addiction seriously. But it also intensified his guilt and self-hatred when he continued to struggle with dependency. He wanted desperately to be a good father, but addiction made it impossible to maintain the consistency and reliability that effective parenting required. The unconditional love he felt for Jakob made his continued drug use feel like a betrayal of the most important relationship in his life. But addiction doesn't respond to moral commitments alone. It requires comprehensive treatment that addresses both physical dependency and underlying psychological issues. Lou Dog, Bradley's Dalmatian, became one of the few constants in his increasingly chaotic existence. The dog accompanied the band on tour, appeared in their music videos, and provided Bradley with the kind of unconditional acceptance that human relationships could no longer offer. "Lou Dog never judged me," Bradley wrote in his journal during a particularly difficult period. He just loved me no matter how far I fell. The relationship provided Bradley with a connection to something pure and uncomplicated that reminded him of who he wanted to be, even when addiction made it impossible to become that person consistently. The dog's presence also served as a reality check during Bradley's worst periods. When his human relationships became too damaged by his behavior, Lou Dog remained, providing a connection to something pure and uncomplicated that helped Bradley remember who he wanted to be. The recording of Sublime's self-titled album in 1995 represented both the pinnacle of their artistic achievement and the beginning of the final chapter of Bradley's life. The songs were more polished and accessible than their earlier work, but they maintained the authenticity and energy that had made the band special. What I Got emerged during these sessions as something special, a song that captured Bradley's philosophy of life and love with deceptive simplicity. "Life's too short, so love the one you got," he sang, the words carrying weight that few listeners understood at the time. For someone living with addiction, every day represented a gamble with mortality, making love and gratitude not just nice sentiments but urgent necessities. But the recording process was also marked by Bradley's increasing unreliability and erratic behavior. Studio sessions had to be scheduled around his addiction cycles, with good days producing brilliant music and bad days resulting in wasted time and mounting expenses. The marriage to Troy in March 1996 represented Bradley's most serious attempt to build a stable life around his music and family. The ceremony was simple but meaningful, attended by close friends and family who hoped that commitment might provide the motivation he needed to overcome his demons. For a few weeks, it seemed like the marriage might mark a turning point. Bradley appeared more focused and optimistic than he had in months. He talked about the future with enthusiasm, making plans for tours and recordings that assumed he would be around to see them realized. But addiction is not overcome by good intentions alone. The pressures of impending success, combined with the physical and psychological grip of heroin dependency, proved stronger than his desire to change. The relapses became more frequent and more dangerous as his tolerance increased and his judgment deteriorated. The final tour in May 1996 was supposed to be a celebration of Sublime's breakthrough success. Their music was receiving radio play, their concerts were selling out, and major labels were expressing serious interest in signing them. Everything Bradley had worked for was finally within reach. But the tour also provided access to new drug sources and the stress of maintaining performance standards while managing withdrawal symptoms. His bandmates and crew members found themselves serving more as caretakers than collaborators, constantly worried about his health and safety. The shows themselves were often brilliant despite Bradley's condition. He possessed the kind of natural charisma and musical intuition that could transcend physical limitations, connecting with audiences even when he was barely functional. But the effort required to maintain these performances was extracting a devastating toll. Friends who interacted with Bradley during the final weeks of his life described someone who seemed to be fighting a losing battle against forces he could no longer control. He would express genuine remorse about his behavior and make sincere promises to change. But the addiction had reached a point where willpower alone was insufficient to overcome physiological dependency. May 25, 1996. The Ocean View Motel in San Francisco was the kind of place where rock bands stayed when budgets were tight and expectations were low. Bradley had checked in after Sublime's show at the Maritime Hall, a performance that fans would later remember as both transcendent and heartbreaking. The final hours of his life remain largely private, but the circumstances suggest someone who had reached the end of his ability to cope with the competing demands of addiction and responsibility. The heroin that killed him was likely intended to manage withdrawal symptoms before another show, but his tolerance had shifted in ways that made his usual dose fatal. Lou Dogg's discovery of Bradley's body the next morning provided a detail that was both heartbreaking and somehow appropriate. The companion who had provided unconditional love throughout his struggles was the one to witness his final silence. The news of Bradley's death reached his bandmates, family, and friends in waves of disbelief and devastating sorrow. For those who had watched him struggle with addiction for years, the outcome wasn't entirely surprising, but the finality was no less crushing. Troy's reaction combined grief with a complex mixture of relief and regret. She had loved Bradley deeply, but had also watched addiction destroy their relationship and threaten their son's well-being. His death ended her hope that he might someday overcome his demons, but it also ended the cycle of hope and disappointment that had defined their lives together. The release of Sublime's self-titled album just 1 week after Bradley's death created a surreal situation where his voice was everywhere while his presence was nowhere. What I Got became a massive hit just as radio stations were reporting news of his overdose, creating a juxtaposition between celebration and mourning that captured the essential tragedy of his story. The success that had eluded Sublime during Bradley's lifetime came immediately and powerfully after his death. The album went multi-platinum. What I Got became a defining song of the 1990s. And Bradley's voice reached audiences around the world who would never have the chance to see him perform live. But this posthumous success also raised uncomfortable questions about the relationship between artistic authenticity and commercial viability. Would Sublime have achieved the same level of success if Bradley had lived to continue evolving their sound? Did his death create a romantic mythology that enhanced the music's appeal? The answer is ultimately unknowable, but what's clear is that Bradley's death froze Sublime at a particular moment of artistic and commercial potential. The music that exists represents a snapshot of what they had achieved by 1996, but not what they might have become with continued development and experimentation. The impact of Sublime's music on popular culture extended far beyond their record sales or radio play. They had created a sound that captured something essential about Southern California youth culture. The blend of rebellion and relaxation, the mixing of different cultural traditions, the tension between optimism and self-destruction. For many listeners, particularly those coming of age in the 1990s, Sublime provided a soundtrack for experiences that other bands couldn't capture. Their music spoke to people who felt caught between different worlds, who were trying to create their own identity from diverse influences, who understood that authenticity was more important than perfection. But the music also carried the seeds of its own tragedy. Songs like Pool Shark and Jailhouse dealt explicitly with addiction and legal troubles, providing listeners with honest portrayals of consequences that many other bands romanticized or ignored. This honesty about addiction's realities may be Bradley's most important legacy. Unlike artists who glamorized drug use or presented it as a pathway to creativity, Bradley's songs often depicted addiction as a trap that destroyed relationships and opportunities. His music served as both celebration of life and warning about the forces that could destroy it. The continuing influence of Sublime can be heard in countless bands that have adopted their approach to genre blending and their commitment to authenticity over commercial calculation. From Slightly Stupid to Pepper to Revolution, the ska-punk reggae fusion that Bradley pioneered has become a recognizable subgenre with devoted audiences worldwide. But perhaps more importantly, Sublime's music continues to provide comfort and connection for listeners dealing with their own struggles. The honesty in Bradley's lyrics about love, loss, addiction, and hope resonates with people facing similar challenges, offering both solidarity and cautionary wisdom. Jacob Nowell's decision to pursue music with his band Law represents both continuation and transformation of his father's legacy. He possesses natural musical talent and an understanding of the family's artistic heritage, but he also carries the weight of expectations and the knowledge of where his father's path led. His music acknowledges Sublime's influence while establishing his own identity, creating songs that honor the past while pointing toward different possibilities. For fans of Bradley's work, Jacob's career provides hope that talent can be channeled in healthier directions, and that artistic legacy can transcend personal tragedy. The annual Sublime tributes and covers by contemporary artists demonstrate the enduring power of the music Bradley created. Each interpretation brings new perspectives to familiar songs while reinforcing their fundamental emotional truths. But these tributes also serve as reminders of what was lost when Bradley died. The voice that could have continued evolving, the songs that were never written, the collaborations that never happened. All represent possibilities that addiction destroyed along with their creator. The Long Beach community that shaped Bradley's musical vision has embraced his legacy, while also acknowledging the cautionary aspects of his story. Local music programs and addiction treatment centers invoke his name when discussing both the power of artistic expression and the importance of seeking help for substance abuse problems. This dual legacy, celebration of artistic achievement combined with honest discussion of addiction's consequences, may represent the most appropriate way to honor Bradley's memory. His music deserves recognition for its creativity and influence, but his death also deserves recognition as a preventable tragedy that robbed the world of continued artistic development. The question that haunts many Sublime fans is whether Bradley's addiction was essential to his creativity, or whether it ultimately limited what he might have achieved. Some argue that his struggles with substances provided emotional depth and authenticity that enhanced his songwriting. Others contend that addiction prevented him from realizing his full potential, and that he might have created even more powerful music if he had been healthy. The truth is probably more complex than either position suggests. Bradley's sensitivity and emotional vulnerability, which made him susceptible to addiction, also enabled him to create music that connected deeply with listeners. But addiction itself was destructive rather than creative, limiting his productivity and threatening his relationships. The music that Bradley created during his brief career represents only a fraction of what he might have contributed if he had lived longer. At 28, most artists are just beginning to reach artistic maturity and develop their most sophisticated work. Bradley's death cut short not just his life, but also the evolution of his artistic vision. Contemporary discussions of addiction and mental health provide frameworks for understanding Bradley's struggles that weren't available during his lifetime. The recognition that addiction is a medical condition rather than a moral failing offers more compassionate approaches to treatment and recovery. But even with improved understanding and treatment options, addiction continues to claim artistic lives and destroy creative potential. Bradley's story remains relevant not as ancient history, but as an ongoing warning about dangers that still threaten musicians and other creative individuals. The hotel room in San Francisco where Bradley died has since been demolished, but the location serves as an unofficial memorial for fans who want to pay respects to his memory. The makeshift shrine that sometimes appears there includes flowers, candles, and handwritten notes from people whose lives were touched by his music. These tributes reflect the personal connection that many listeners feel to Bradley's work and life story. His music spoke to experiences and emotions that felt authentic and universal, creating bonds between artist and audience that transcended the typical celebrity-fan relationship. But the memorial also serves as a reminder of the finality of death and the permanence of loss. No amount of posthumous success or critical acclaim can restore what addiction took away: the opportunity for continued growth, development, and artistic exploration. 28 years after his death, Bradley Nowell's voice continues to reach new generations of listeners who discover Sublime's music through streaming services, movie soundtracks, and recommendations from older fans. The songs that were created in Long Beach garages and recorded in modest studios have become part of the permanent soundtrack of American youth culture. But each new listener who discovers What I Got, or Santeria, also encounters the story of their creator's early death, creating opportunities for education about addiction's realities and the importance of seeking help when substances begin to control rather than enhance life. This educational aspect of Bradley's legacy may be its most important dimension. His music provides entry points for discussions about creativity, authenticity, cultural fusion, and the risks that sometimes accompany artistic sensitivity. The voice that sang, "Life's too short, so love the one you got," was silenced far too early. But the message continues to resonate with people who understand that time is precious and love is essential. Bradley Nowell's greatest achievement may be that he created music capable of outliving the personal demons that ultimately destroyed him. In the end, Bradley Nowell represents both the power and the fragility of artistic creation. He demonstrated that beautiful music can emerge from difficult circumstances, that authenticity resonates across cultural boundaries, and that creative vision can transcend personal limitations. But he also demonstrated that talent alone is insufficient protection against self-destructive forces, that success can arrive too late to save someone from their demons, and that the very sensitivity that enables great art can also enable great self-destruction. His legacy lives in every song that blends genres fearlessly, every artist who chooses authenticity over commercial safety, every listener who finds comfort in honest portrayals of life's struggles. But it also lives in cautionary tales about addiction's power and the importance of seeking help before personal demons silence creative voices forever. Bradley Nowell created a sound that defined Southern California and influenced music worldwide, but the most important sound he made may have been his voice calling for help. A call that came too late to save him but might still save others who recognized their own struggles in his story.